Welcome to Book Club Date, the show where a husband and wife invite you to join in discussion of our latest read. Today, that read is The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern.
We're going to start out with a quick spoiler-free review for those of you who just want to know if the book is up your alley. And then if you've read the book, we welcome you to, or if you don't care about spoilers, you can stay as we dive into a brief plot summary followed by some discussion questions and discussion about the book.
Then we'll hear what the author has to say about their own book, and then we'll take a look at the broader community reviews on Goodreads.
So wherever you're listening or watching, we'd like to invite you to follow our channel and participate in the comments. Give your input on the questions that we go over and what you thought of the book. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get started.
All right, let's do the very brief backflap synopsis. The Starless Sea. A graduate student, Zachary Ezra Rollins, stumbles upon a mysterious book that leads him on a journey through a hidden underground realm. With clues like a bee, a key, and a sword, he explores a secret library and its fantastical worlds alongside Mirabel and Dorian, protectors of this magical archive. As they navigate lost cities and time-crossing love stories, they fight to save the sanctuary from those who wish to destroy it, all while Zachary discovers his own purpose. Pretty intriguing title and synopsis. Mm-hmm. So, Katie, what was your spoiler-free review?
So I didn't know what to expect coming into this. She did a great job of some really artistic writing. There's a lot of mystery and intrigue in this story, and it's definitely unique. I did feel like the pacing was good at the beginning and end, but it did slow down a little bit in the middle. And there were some answers to some of the mysteries presented that I would have liked to have gotten some answers just a little bit sooner, just to kind of keep me into it a little bit more instead of everything being so heavily on the back end. I think it was definitely a unique read. It's not something that, was very trope-ish or expected. So if you're looking for a unique read, a unique story with some mystery, a little bit of romance, a little bit of adventure, I think you would really enjoy this book.
All right. Was there anything that you didn't particularly care about it? Or I know, again, this is spoiler-free, so she's only going to get so detailed about it. But was there anything that you care to share that maybe you didn't like about it or that you were kind of meh on?
I think just the pacing in the middle being a little too slow for me. It just kind of started to lose me a little bit. And so I had to focus a little bit to keep going. And then once it hit its stride again at the end, it picked up more again at the end and you got some answers and stuff. But that's what I think it slowed down because you had all these questions and questions and questions. And you're like lots of speculation that you're doing, and you didn't get many answers until it got more toward the end. And then you're like, oh, okay, here are some answers. Here's what's going on. Oh, I like that. But I think just a little sooner would have helped me with that.
That's fair. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So those are my two biggest critiques without going into like major spoilers.
Sure. This is now your official spoiler warning. This is it. You're not getting any more. So if you've read the book, welcome. If you don't care about spoilers, welcome. Here we go. So this book, by its very nature, is difficult to sum up, especially toward the end, but we're going to do our best. I think this book is one that kind of favors a vibe and emotional points over plot points. Mm-hmm. I think it's kind of fair to say that. But the Starless Sea itself is ultimately about, at least from my perspective, it was about two overarching love stories. One is wrapping up. That would be the Keeper and Mirabel, a.k.a. Fate. And the other is just beginning, Zach and Dorian. Zach is the pre-mentioned protagonist that you heard about in the synopsis. Both of these love stories are revealed gradually to the reader. And this overarching story is supported by a multitude of short stories that add to the overall feel and plot. So there's stories within stories. It's really cool.
Lots of storyception going on.
Yeah, it can get a little bit exhausting, but we'll get into that. So this book is divided into 6 books or chapters, and we'll let Katie summarize book 1.
So beginning with book 1, we meet our main character, Zachary Ezra Rollins, and it is kind of interesting. She does make it really clear which chapters follow him and which chapters are following the short stories. So Zachary is a graduate student that discovers a mysterious book that contains a story of his own childhood. So his an experience he had in his childhood is within this book, which would be kind of freaky to find a book where you're like, wait, that's me. That happened to me.
Right.
But not just did that happen to me, that is me. And the book is called Sweet Sorrows. So this book is a collection of stories, and it's got one about a pirate and his lover, which with retrospect is the beginning of one of the aforementioned love stories. There's a story about a boy in a library and a girl in a forest. And then Zach's story about a boy finding a door in an alley. That story is from Zach's childhood, and that prompts him to do a little more research and dig deeper into where the book actually came from. He finds out that there's a group called the Collectors Club, and it's after this book. They want this book. So that leaves you with some questions right from the get-go, right? Like, why is Zachary in this book, and why do they want the book? What is so important about this book? Zach meets a man named Dorian, who he is just absolutely quickly smitten with. You know, a love at first sight kind of thing. Dorian seems to know a lot about what's going on, and he's got this goal that is unknown to Zach, so Zach's not sure who to trust, who not to trust. He does tentatively trust Dorian because he's attracted to him. There's this spark, this kind of soul recognition with him. Dorian gets Zach to the harbor of the Starless Sea by opening a painted door that's been left in Central Park. So it's painted on a wall, basically, and they are able to go through this door. But Dorian gets captured by the Collectors Club and this woman named Allegra before he can actually pass through the door. So Zach is flung into this harbor of the Starless Sea on his own, having no answers, loads of questions, not sure who to trust or what's going on.
Yeah, it's book one I thoroughly enjoyed. Mm-hmm. I really did.
Intriguing.
It is a very intriguing setup to the overall book. And then going into book two, now we're in this Starless Sea. We're in this harbor, as it were, which is effectively this big library, the subterranean library, which is a really cool concept.
It's really neat.
But book two, I believe she titles it Fortune and Fables. And in this book / chapter, this book, just chapter 2, book 2, there's more interweaving short stories. There's a moon falling in love with an innkeeper. I actually kind of really like that one.
I really liked that story too.
That one was
that
cute.
Might be my favorite of the short stories that were given.
I agree. There's a story about an owl king that eats fate's eyes. Kind of crazy. Mm-hmm. And in context now, you're kind of like, okay, I get it a little bit. And then it's learned that the pirate and his lover, actually, the ones that we mentioned earlier, they've had many reincarnations throughout time, but they're always torn apart.
And that's kind of like that Cloud Atlas kind of vibe, right?
Yeah.
If you've seen that movie where it's like these two souls that just keep coming together and finding each other lifetime after lifetime.
I never
just to be torn apart.
Cloud Atlas is such a good reference point for this book. Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. The difference though in this one is that the pirate isn't reincarnating. He's the same every time. Like he stays the same. He's not.
Yeah, I think
he's not the one passing. It's the lover that passes away, reincarnating, and then they find each other again, and he's kind of has to have it's an incredible love, right? To be patient as your love finds you and falls in love with you again
and again
through all of their lifetimes, while you just stay
and you're going to
steady.
lose them each time.
Yeah,
which is kind of brutal. So anyway, there's all these kind of short stories, but amongst all these stories, there's the main plot that continues to move forward, and that is Zach's story, right? So he discovers this vast library that I just mentioned. It's made up of cozy rooms that are filled with books, cats, and art. He also meets a woman named Mirabel, which he kind of met prior. But anyway, he gets to know Mirabel a bit more, and a man who seems to run the place in solitude, who is called the Keeper. Mirabel and Zach together leave the harbor, returning to New York City, and together they go and rescue Dorian. Remember, Allegra, who is, I guess, the leader of the collectors, captured Dorian whenever Zach went through that door. Dorian didn't get a chance to go through whenever they're in Central Park. So They go back to rescue him. Zach learns that the Collectors Club is trying to destroy portals.
Which are the painted doors.
Which are the painted doors, with the goal of protecting the Starless Sea. So they want to protect the Starless Sea, basically because they put so high a value on it that it's basically not really, like, no one's really worthy of it, I think is their kind of logic. So they just want to destroy all these doors.
Like, kind of like, you know how the Alexander's library, right? Like the Library of Alexandria got destroyed. And it's like, we know there were so many works held within that library that just you can't recover now. They're gone. It's destroyed. It's gone.
Yeah.
And no one knows like the extent of what knowledge was lost with that. And I think it's kind of their goal is to prevent something like that from happening. They're like, these books are treasures. This knowledge needs to be protected at all costs. And one of the ways to do that is destroying the portals so that people can't find their way into it and destroy it.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah,
that makes sense. Yeah, so that wraps up book 2 or chapter 2, and then book 3. Katie?
So book 3, we get introduced to the Ballad of Eleanor and Simon. Eleanor is the girl in the forest that we mentioned earlier, featured in one of the short stories within book 1. A man named Simon Keating meets her in a space where time is disrupted. Basically, time does not exist within this one cozy room of the Starless Sea library. And so they meet in this room through going through these doors, which must have been portals from different times. And they fall in love. Eleanor does become pregnant during one of their encounters because time doesn't work the same way there. For one of them, it could be several months before they meet each other again. For another, it could be just a couple of hours. So they do fall in love. Eleanor becomes pregnant, and then they never find each other again after that. Meanwhile, in our main plot following Zachary, Zach and who's with Mirabel at this time.
Mirabel.
Zach finds this other book called The Ballad of Eleanor and Simon, which tells their story. So we get little glimpses into their story interwoven with Zach's story. Mirabel, who actually is the painter of these doors, the portals, shows Zach where the Starless Sea used to be. So an ancient part of
like the harbor. So there's
of the harbor. It's basically like there are multiple harbors, right? So she takes him to an old harbor.
Right. So there's like their current harbor, and then basically, so there's like the initial subterranean, like this is how I interpret it. Feel free to correct me.
Yeah, like a subterranean cave.
Yeah, and then there's levels to it, and each harbor has been abandoned, as the Starless Sea rose and rose. Sorry about the camera there if you're watching. Right. But each harbor has been abandoned.
It's been falling, right? The level of the seas have been lowering, so she takes him down to like a lower level of a harbor. Yeah,
so I interpret it as like the Starless Sea rose and kept rising through the ages, and it receded.
Yeah.
So that's why they were all abandoned, because it kept rising.
So they had to keep moving the harbors up.
But now it's receded, so now it's just these desolate harbor town community type things, and they're all at different levels.
Yeah, they're abandoned, like they're empty. They're and that was one of the things that I was kind of like, okay, what's going on? Because even like the harbor that Zachary first comes to is basically empty, like except for Mirabel, the keeper, and then one, she's called an acolyte, and I can't remember her name.
I can't either.
But like that's it. Like these 3 people are there, and then a bunch of cats.
The cats.
And one of the cats does get attached to Zachary and follows him about and such. But yeah, lots of cats. So Mirabel takes Zach to one of these abandoned harbors where the Starless Sea used to be, one of the lower levels. And it's receded. The Starless Sea has receded now so far down that it's now just an abyss. And it's also revealed that Mirabel and the Keeper are lovers. They've got a little thing going on.
All right, and then that wrapped up book 3. But then going into book 4, Zach listens as the tale of the moon and the innkeeper unfolds further. So remember how I mentioned that was one of my favorite short stories?
Yeah, mine too.
There's actually a continuation to that proceeds in book 4. The moon seeks assist. And by the way, it's kind of written, these short stories are written like fables almost. So they're
like fairy tales.
Yeah. They're fairy tales. So the moon seeks assistance from death and time. Okay. And it's because the moon wants to remain with the innkeeper. Time consents and relocates the end to a realm beyond its own, granting the moon the opportunity to meet the innkeeper. In exchange, time implores the moon to discover a method to bring it back together with fate. So there's time and fate, moon and innkeeper, Zach and Dorian. There's a lot of love stories. There's a lot of love in this book. You just got to read between the lines a little bit.
Yeah.
Shortly thereafter, the harbor begins to deteriorate. And that's the main harbor that's our current harbor that we're in. Allegra arrives to confront Dorian. So remember Allegra, they went to go rescue Dorian. They rescued Dorian. He's back. Zach and him had a bit more development. We didn't really highlight that here, but they have a bit more development in their kind of romance and chemistry. Mm-hmm. And then Allegra arrives, who is the closest thing to like a traditional antagonist that I think we have. So Allegra, the leader of the collectors, arrives, and I don't know if she was like Dorian's mom or adopted mom or like sister or what. I did not understand their relationship at all. Maybe I just missed it. But Allegra arrives to confront Dorian.
I think she was more like the mentor. Like she brings Dorian into the guild.
Yeah.
Or the collectors club.
Right. And then the harbor
is basically his mentor.
The harbor loses its floor. Right, at this confrontation between Allegra and Dorian and the Keeper, and everyone's in the same room. Sorry about the camera. It keeps spazzing. I'm going to get up and fix it here in a minute. But Allegra arrives, and basically the floor falls out from under them.
Mm-hmm. Within, like, the foyer type area.
Yeah, and then Dorian falls in it, as does Allegra. So they disappear. Zach and Dorian had finally just kind of realized their love for each other, so that's sad. And then Mirabel also fell in it, but she re-arrives to wrap up this chapter. And then that's when I guess we kind of realize that the Keeper and Mirabel were you realize it before, but you realize like how deep it is. And this is when kind of like this facade of Mirabel goes away and it becomes fate. I know the camera keeps doing it.
It does.
So anyway, so that kind of wraps up book 4.
Yeah, so you find out that Mirabel is fate.
Right. I'm going to let Katie finish wrapping up.
So Mirabel is fate, and and the Keeper is time. So he's the one who stays the same throughout his existence, and then fate, Mirabel, is the one who he keeps losing, and then she comes back. She reincarnates basically again and again, and he's there and steady and patient as she finds him and then falls in love with him over and over and over again. And so their goal is there's a particular circumstance that needs to be met in order for Mirabel to incarnate and remain, so that they can just stay together. So they've waited for that. He's waited for that. I guess they've both waited for that.
Yeah, I mean the Keeper just sits there and writes in his journal the whole time. So.
Right, and he's got an office full of journals that you find out are basically their love story through each of her reincarnations.
Yeah.
So
drastic.
It is.
All right. I missed the first part of that. Did you wrap up book 5? Did you do that?
No, we didn't get into book 5.
Oh, okay. All right. Well.
So.
Katie, tell us about book 5.
In book 5, the Keeper reveals his eternal bond to Mirabel, which we already kind of got into, confessing that they've been entwined through countless lifespans. He exists beyond the confines of time, but he perpetually faces the loss of Mirabel, who, as we've discussed, is fate, who reincarnates in various guises, various interpretations. Zach comes to the realization then that the Keeper is none other than the pirate and that he symbolizes time. And Mirabel represents his lover, known as Fate. Because remember, Zach had that book. He's had several books, the Sweet Sorrows one, and then I can't remember the second one. The Ballad of Eleanor and Simon. Yeah. And so he has learned of these love stories through those, right? So these stories that were presented as fairy tales are in books that he's read. So he's read them, we've read them. So we find out that, the keeper is the pirate, is time. Mirabel is the lover, is fate. Additionally, we find out that Mirabel is actually the progeny of Eleanor. So remember, Simon and Eleanor met in that room beyond time, and Eleanor got pregnant and had a baby in the harbor of the Starless Sea, and that is Mirabel. So she grew up in that harbor beyond time. She was conceived beyond time, outside of time. Together, Zach and Mirabel venture into the abyss under the pretense of saving Dorian, but Mirabel harbors a hidden agenda which will be disclosed later. The duo is torn apart in the abyss in one of the old abandoned harbors, but Simon intervenes and rescues Zach. Zach stumbles upon a paper star that's inscribed with his destiny, and ultimately he discards it. He doesn't want to know his destiny that's been laid out for him. In a parallel turn of events, Dorian finds salvation with Eleanor. Remember, Eleanor and Simon were together, and Eleanor is Mirabel's mother. So Eleanor's navigating the Starless Sea aboard her vessel, her ship. Following Allegra's demise from her fall, she does not live through the fall. Eleanor escorts Dorian back to the inn. So we find out that innkeeper was at, that inn is actually in another layer of a former harbor of the Starless Sea, basically.
Yeah, and just real quick, I just want to clarify. Remember how Dorian and Allegra fell basically through a hole in the foyer? Mm-hmm. They fell all the way down, and they fell into the Starless Sea. Well, what is the Starless Sea? The Starless Sea is honey.
So it's not a water. It's not a water.
It's honey.
Ocean.
It's like this magical honey. It's this vast ocean of honey. Mm-hmm. So Allegra, I guess, died, whether by drowning or impact, and Dorian somehow survived. And Eleanor is in this ship sailing the Starless Sea, mm-hmm. which I guess her ship is the one on the cover of the book. But there you go. There's some context about where
she
they're at.
Pulls Dorian out of the honey, out of the Starless Sea, and gets. I think they bring buckets of water to clean him off because he's just covered in this honey, just dripping in it.
He's sticky.
You don't want to drown in honey.
Clearly not.
No.
I bet Erin had to really think about so how would you function covered in honey?
Yeah.
Anyway.
All the honey. Let's see. So Eleanor, ship captain / Mirabel's mom, mm-hmm. saves Dorian, escorts him to the inn. It's there that the moon bestows upon Dorian a box containing the heart of fate. So now Dorian has met the innkeeper and the moon, who we know are lovers from that short story.
Yeah. So Dorian has the heart of fate. Moving into book 6, which is our final book. So we're near the end of our kind of summary here. In book 6, Zach finds himself adrift in his wanderings. Remember, he got separated from Mirabel, and he met Simon, and he had an encounter with Simon, and he's encountered Simon, who's gone mad, or at least obsessive over quote unquote the story. He has the story, I guess, of everything on ribbons in this temple. It's kind of a weird scene. Anyway, Zach eventually comes upon doors. He finds himself in a snow-covered field and lives out a fake but very real scenario that involves a normal life with Dorian at his mother's farmhouse. So something is deceiving him. I couldn't really understand what was trying to deceive him or why. I didn't quite get it. But anyway, he sees through that it's fake. He sees through the deception. He sees that this is not his mother's farmhouse. This is not Dorian. Eventually, he does encounter the real Dorian, but in a fateful moment, Dorian draws his sword and pierces Zach's heart. He kills Zach.
So Dorian has been going through this section
also like a deceptive area.
Yeah, a very deceptive area where there's these creatures, these things that are pretending to be Zachary, and it takes Dorian, the first one almost gets him, and then he realizes, oh, you're not actually Zachary, right? Because he's going to like save him, and then this thing kind of tries to kill him, and so Dorian's like, I can't trust what I see. You're trying to tell me you're Zachary. You're not. It's false. These are lies. None of you are Zachary. So when he comes across the real Zachary, he thinks it's one of these creatures that is pretending to be Zachary. And so he skewers him with his sword.
Basically. And Zach dies. So he wakes up in the afterlife, basically. Some variation of the afterlife. Where I interpret it as he's basically the size of an ant. And he's in this gigantic room that's been referenced a few times of like this dollhouse, doll town kind of room where like everyday objects create this town. Like a kid would imagine how a town would be like if they had whatever objects around them, right? Like say like a bottle of laundry detergent is a building. Maybe a kid, if they're playing with that with like their little action figures, they view that as like a town. So Zach wakes up in this.
Like, have you seen the Lego movie?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. So at the end, you find out.
You're good with the references today.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I'm on top of it.
Kudos.
So spoilers for the Lego movie. But at the end, you find out that this whole Lego city, right, is city set up created of like out of the Legos, right? So it basically, yeah, like a setup play area kind of thing, but it's like models, like a model city, right?
That's good.
And so, but you find out through one of the earlier short stories that this was an area within the harbor that I think Mirabel created as a kid. And then like other people that were there would come and like bring her things to add to her like giant diorama city setup kind of thing.
I never picked up on that it was Mirabel who made it.
I mean, maybe not, but she was the only child in.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things about this book is that you can interpret things a few different ways.
Yeah, like it could have been her. It could have been her mom, because didn't Eleanor kind of like get lost in the woods?
Yeah,
and ended up there. So I think it was one of them, because those were the only children that were mentioned within the harbor. Yeah. Of the Starless Sea.
Yeah. So Zach. Like we said, he wakes up in that afterlife. There's this doll kind of house area. And he makes his way to like the center dollhouse. And there's bees everywhere. These bees, I guess, are the ones who make the honey of the Starless Sea. Or maybe they're just there because of the honey. I don't know. But they can make anything out of honey. And they speak to him as like this hive mind kind of thing. And they arrange for him to speak with Mirabel. So Mirabel reveals to Zach that his demise was the crucial element needed to bring closure to her tale and allow for a new beginning. Remember how at the beginning of all this, I said that there was basically two overarching love stories. This is the conclusion of one of those love stories and the beginning of the other. So the Starless Sea, or Sea of Honey, begins to rise. It just rises. It floods this afterlife area. And then it floods, I guess, real life, people who are alive. It floods the harbors, and they go up and up and up. Remember how we described all these levels? It proceeds to flood them up and up and up. And then Eleanor
so
basically...
the sea level is rising.
Yeah, so Eleanor rescues Dorian, and then the Keeper and a cat and the Acolyte also get out. There's various little short little segments for each of them on how they kind of escape the Starless Sea. And then Zach does come back to Dorian. His body does, at least. And Dorian saves him by using that heart, that fate of heart or whatever, to like revive him, like on Eleanor's ship as the sea level is rising. So that is to say that is like a whole lot going on. But simultaneous to all this,
there's a lot. So we apologize if we left out one of your favorite parts.
Yeah, there's this book.
There's a lot.
This book is it has a lot to unpack. So, and then simultaneously, there's Zach's friend Katrina, I think is her name, but she goes by Kat or whatever. I'm not sure. Has been on a quest for answers about Zach's whereabouts because Zach was in college. He found this book.
He was in grad school. One day he just disappeared.
Like, where did he go? So his friend Katrina is looking for him, and her search leads her to a mysterious gateway that opens into the Starless Sea. I could get into her whole discovery thing, but frankly, I feel like we've summed up enough. And like I said, Dorian did procure the Heart of Fate. That saved Zach, rekindling his life. And then at the very end, at the end of all this, Mirabel and the Keeper, Time and Fate, reunite, and it marks the conclusion of their narrative, and it heralds the dawn of Zach and Dorian and Katrina, because she found her way to the Starless Sea as well.
Right.
So that
and sort of Mirabel and the Keeper still, because Mirabel doesn't have to, because she was born this time outside of time, or conceived outside of time, she gets to stay.
Yeah.
So she doesn't have to continue the reincarnation cycle.
Yeah. So
she's done.
Yeah. Like,
so they get to
this is their final
together.
life together, basically, I think is what we're taking away from it.
Yeah.
So that was, I am aware, Katie is aware, that was about 25 minutes of, if you never read this book, you probably are like, what the heck? If you have read the book, you probably are anxious for the discussion questions. And the very first one I want to talk about is, it is clear that the plot of this story is not the most clear cut.
Yes.
So, quote from The Starless Sea, after a few pages, the story shifts, and Zachary cannot tell if it is a novel or a short story collection, or perhaps a story within a story. He wonders if it will return and loop back to the previous part. End quote. This line from the beginning of the book foreshadows some of the style of writing and kind of the structure of everything. Do you feel that the goal of this was like more of, as the kids say, a vibe in Erin's writing rather than the prioritizing plot? Or, I'm just going to say it. Did she kind of miss the mark? I'll just be transparent. It wasn't my absolute favorite read. I found it intriguing. Mm-hmm. It was definitely outside the norm of what I expected and what I've come to expect from like a fantasy book. So it was refreshing in that respect, but It was also just, I found it really hard to follow, much more so than many other fantasy books, which isn't a bad thing in and of itself. Like, I read textbooks, I read history books, I study various books. It's not a big deal, but I just felt like I had to parse a lot of things.
Yeah. There is a lot of effort, I guess you could say, that you need to make as the reader, to make some of the connections that she provides throughout it. It's definitely a unique structure. Definitely unique. I thought it was interesting. So my feelings on it kind of shifted throughout the reading, right? I felt like at the beginning I was kind of like, what is going on? Like, we've got this main storyline and then we've got these short stories, and I was kind of like, are these relevant? How is this working? So once they did become relevant, then I was like, oh, okay, this is more interesting. I think you've got to be in the mood for it.
That's fair.
Like, you've got to be in the mood for something that you're going to have to, like, it's almost a little more cerebral, right? Like, you're going to have to
put the book down and think about what you just read, which
I think is a healthy thing for
you're going to
have to make some connections on your own. She's not going to spoon feed it to you.
Correct.
But if you're aware going in that that's kind of the structure, like, these short stories are relevant and they are going to come back and they are going to be used, I think that helps. That helps, and you can read them with the intent to knowing that you're going to want to remember them versus being like, is this relevant or not? But I did think it was unique the way she interwove them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I also thought her style of writing, for like the main plot, which was Zach, was very modern in what you kind of expect. And then her fables and fairy tales are very characteristic of like a translation of like a Brothers Grimm or something like that. It's very fairy tale inspired. Yeah, and it's almost poetic. Like, there's many lines in here that I absolutely loved. I was like, that is so beautifully put, and it just leaves you with like more of an emotional feel than like a specific recall of what the line was. It's
and you're just like, oh, that was like really creative, really artistic, just a very specific use of phrasing.
Yeah. Something that you can tell.
I think poetic's a good word too.
Yeah, it's there are lines
very thoughtful.
Yeah, and like there are lines that you could tell were either straight inspiration, right, or she sat down and thought about a lot.
Yeah,
and both of those are wonderful to have.
They are.
So, anyway, like we said, plot wasn't most clear cut. I think that's probably the biggest gripe and why it was discussion question number 1. So I'm kind of curious. I've looked at a few reviews of the community. We'll go into those a bit more later on in the show. But what was your thought about the plot?
Yeah, let us
know below. We'll be down there. We'll be happy to chat with you. Our second discussion question. We have 2 love stories. Time and Fate, a.k.a. the Keeper and Mirabel, and then Zach and Dorian. Do these love stories work? Did you find them believable? And do you think one was more interesting than the other? What do you think?
So I thought Time and Fate, that was quite fascinating. That was interesting. And I enjoyed the interweaving of their fairy tale short story with the reality. Because it was 2 different perspectives on the same story, the same characters. And so I found that interesting. With Zach and Dorian, I felt like they needed a little more development. I love romances. I am totally cool with a love at first sight kind of thing. But for me, it was a little like, you're going through all this and you're just like, and we're in love. And I would have liked to have seen, and I'm sure in her mind there was a lot more development between those 2. And I'm sure there's a lot that wasn't included in the book, but I would have liked just a little bit more development. But I think that's part of the point, though, right? That it's the beginning of their love story.
Right. And you know, Zach is he is hesitant because he has this initial, I don't want to say love at first sight, infatuation with Dorian, right? Dorian is this older man. He's kind of gruff. He's got the 5 o'clock shadow. He looks like a PI. At least that's how I pictured him in my mind. He's aloof, right? And their first interaction is like, is Dorian talking closely into Zach's ear in a closet.
Yeah, in the dark.
In the dark, in a very seductive tone.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't know. If that was my first impression, being locked in a room with someone and they were talking like that to me, I'd be a little on edge, actually. But Zach, I guess, is into that. So that's cool. Whatever. Okay, not to jump into another book, but another series. Mistborn Era 2. You have Wax, Wayne, and Steris, right?
Yeah.
You've got Wax, our main character, and Steris. In the first book of that series, you don't really care for Steris at all. And I think by the second or third book, you're just like, everyone must protect Steris at all costs. And that's because Wax didn't care. Like, you follow along with Wax's emotional journey involving that involves Steris. And he goes from that same, I don't care for Steris all that much. He's more of like, I have to deal with her, to I'm in love with this woman. I'll never let anything bad happen to her. And that there was no type of development or payoff even close to that with Zach and Dorian, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So that, you know, but again, I don't read a terrible amount of romances. Most of my romances that I read are kind of like adjacent to another kind of main
It's not
story.
The main plot line.
Right,
it's like
right.
The
So,
plot or...
so I think you had a much better take on it. But that's kind of my, that's my 2 cents.
Yeah.
So moving forward, quote, not all stories speak to all listeners, but all listeners can find a story that does somewhere, sometime, in one form or another. End quote. Did this story speak to you, or did any of the short stories speak to you?
I mean, I think so. I think everyone's going to have a favorite of the short stories.
Yeah.
You know, like we've already discussed, for me, it was The Moon and Keeper. It was just a beautiful development of like, just stuck in this snowstorm, this terrible storm, and she's there to meet a friend, and the friend is late, and so she is just there, and they gradually fall in love. They're drinking wine, they're getting to know each other, and like you get that passage of time and the development of their relationship. And so like that one clearly stood out and stayed with me the most. I think different parts of the book overall though are going to stick with you more than others.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of one of the interesting things about the Starless Sea being made of honey, right? Because it's a collection, like the harbors are collections of stories, and the Starless Sea kind of is this collection of stories, and some of them are going to stick with you, and honey sticks with you. Yeah. And so it's kind of like...
Well, and how is honey made? Right.
By bees.
By bees. Bees make honey by going out to flowers.
Mm-hmm.
They leave their home, they go out, they collect pollen, and they bring it back and they make honey.
Much like the stories are being collected.
Yeah, thousands of bees go out and collect pollen to do this. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if some of these parallels were intended, but I think that's one of the nice things about stories kind of like this, where there's a lot that's open to interpretation and a lot that you can take from it. And I think it's one of those books that if you go back to, like if you read it now and then you go back to it in 5, 10 years, 20 years, however long, I think different things are going to stand out to you and stay with you. But I do think it's kind of an analogy for like libraries and the importance of books and stories and how they do stick with you. Even if this book itself doesn't stick with you, there are certainly stories that you've read or heard that stick with you and kind of shape your paradigm and your experience.
Right. And speaking of stories that stick with you, don't necessarily have to be bound.
Right.
I mean, it can be
for a long
told
time.
Word of mouth. Yeah, it can be something it could be a story that you experience. It could be, any way.
I mean, for a long time, the tradition was oral. Mm-hmm. Like stories were passed down orally. So
yeah. So, well,
I think overall, like before we move on, I do think when you kind of look at it like this and interpret it in this way, it's kind of like overall a love story to stories, to storytelling, to libraries, to books overall, right? Yeah. So
Allegra, as I mentioned, is like the closest thing that we have to like an antagonist.
Yeah.
Other than her, because she dies in the honey.
Right.
Who is the antagonist? What is it? Right? Because stories are usually, man versus man versus environment, man versus something.
Yeah.
What are they fighting against? Right? Like it's.
So I think it.
I don't know if it was.
I think it depends on which characters you are rooting for the most.
Okay.
So, because overall, Zachary dying, right, that whole situation, and the basically flooding and destruction of this harbor is what had to happen in order for Mirabel and the Keeper to be together, right? So Mirabel, I would say, is rooting for the destruction, right? Like they're kind of rooting for the destruction.
Right.
Allegra was trying to prevent the destruction.
Okay.
So that's where I think it just really depends on which character you're following. And then for Zachary and Dorian, I think it's the introduction of it gave me the impression that they're going to start a new harbor potentially or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Or the Starless Sea is just lost. It's done. Like that phase of life is just done. Period. Ended.
Right.
And maybe there's going to be something new.
I mean, I think there is.
So
this cat opened the door with the feather and the
right.
whatever the new symbols were.
Right. So we've got something new, and you're gonna follow them. So I think it just depends.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
On who you're following, and what outcome you desire. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
because that's what it is. What's preventing the outcome that you desire? So if the two main pairings want different outcomes, then yeah. So it just kind of yeah.
All right. Moving forward, Mirabel, aka Fate, indicates that she doesn't force people in any one direction. She just literally presents them options, and with her power, it'd be the form of these doors. So, quote, she is young enough to carry fear with her without letting it into her heart, without being scared. She wears her fear lightly, like a veil, aware that there are dangers, but letting the crackling awareness hover around her. It does not sink in. It buzzes in excitement like a swarm of invisible bees. End quote. In the case of Zachary, that is Eleanor. That's the girl in the forest. That's one of the short stories, and that's about Eleanor. In the case of Zachary, what do you think happens if he opens the door when he was a child? So what I'm getting at is Eleanor obviously was presented with a door when she was a child in the forest.
And she went through it.
Zachary was presented with a door in an alley around the corner from, I guess, his mom's shop, right?
Like the alley behind her shop.
Yeah, and he decided not to go through it.
Yeah.
So I guess this is us just kind of just getting into just some speculation.
Okay.
Would he have a similar experience to Eleanor, or would he have a different one? If, like, he goes through there, he gets to the harbor. Does he ever find his way back to his mom? Because he seemed like he was a bit older than Eleanor whenever the door was presented to him, which is probably why he was more cautious.
I think was a little bit older. And we do find out that Mirabel painted that door as well, and actually had an interaction with Zachary's mom, who is referred to as the psychic or the intuitive. So we know that she's got...
Yeah, she's a fortune teller.
Yeah. And so it's interesting, like, even in the future time, right, when Kat is worried about where is Zachary, where did he go, and Zach's mom is like, he's coming back. Like, I don't know what you're all worried about. He's coming back. He's not dead. He's not gone. Like, she's like, I don't know. I'm a fortune teller. I'm psychic. I got this. Like, he's somewhere. I don't know where he is, but he's somewhere and he's coming back. So I'm not worried. So that's kind of interesting. So I don't know. I would be curious to know about when people started abandoning the harbor, because when Zachary does make it there, right, it's pretty abandoned, except for like the 3 or 4 people and that are in the harbor. And then, like, of course, there's a few other people like on the ship sailing the Starless Sea. And you get the impression that there are other harbors. I would be curious. I'd be curious if Zach had opened the door as a child. Would there have been more people there? Mm-hmm. Would the destruction have happened at the same time, or would it have happened earlier? You know, I think it would have made his relationship with Dorian a little weirder. Well, so Allegra left the sea.
Right.
And started the club and then found Dorian. Like, that's kind of the order of those. So I don't know. I don't know if it could have worked out.
Right.
If Zachary had stayed.
I mean, maybe that was part of Zach's development.
I would say it was, because I think
refusal of going through it the first time.
And I think it kind of motivated him to go through a little more fearlessly when it came around again, right? Because he's like, when he read the book, and then he was like, "Oh, I should have done it. I
think he even has a moment like that, doesn't he?
I think he does, right? Where he's like, I should have done it. Yeah, I'm not going to let this opportunity pass me another time. I should have done it before. I regret not doing it before." Mm-hmm. And if you're ever indecisive, that's a little hack. Like, is this something you're going to regret in the future? Yes or no? So, yeah.
Okay. Next question.
Yeah. So our next question is from, quote, "Each of us has our own path, Mr. Rollins. Symbols are for interpretation, not definition, end quote. This is a story about symbols. There are a lot of symbols. What do you think that the bee, key, and sword meant?
Yeah, that's a lot. It's a lot to unpack. So the sword obviously was the collectors. The bee, there are bees everywhere as symbols throughout the Starless Sea, about the harbor. Like, they're everywhere. They're in paintings, they're on statues, they're sculpted. The key, there are keys hang everywhere as well. Well, not everywhere, but they're kind of, the collectors keep them. They were keys to those doors that open those doors.
Well, they kept the doorknobs too.
Yeah. So I'm going to be honest. I wrote this question, and I wrote it because I don't know. I don't know what the bee, the key, and the sword meant. Do you have any thoughts, hon? Or should we leave that to our audience?
In the beginning, one of the short stories, well, several of the short stories, we're talking about like the acolytes, and their symbol was the bee.
Yeah.
And they were kind of like the keepers of the stories, the protectors of the stories. And then the sword was the people like out collecting the stories and bringing them in.
Right. Okay.
And then what was the key?
I forget what the key was.
Yeah.
It was something about.
But they were basically
you chose
like
the key or something.
Yeah, they were basically like my interpretation, right? Like when you basically joined the harbor, there were 3 paths you could take. And one was the acolyte, basically like the silent librarians who would help people find what they were looking for. The collectors who would go out and get the stories and bring more stories in. And then the third one was the other one. I can't remember what it was called.
I can't recall, and that's kind of like, I noticed that as like a repeating theme with this book, because there's some books I read and I can recall just about like every single point of it. And this one,
that one was
a
little more ambiguous because like Zachary was the key, right? Like at one point, I think when he get like it burned on him.
Yes, he does. It's like cold, right?
Yeah. It's like when he's dead and it like gets.
Yeah, because he's wearing it.
Burnt on. Yeah, it gets kind of like.
Or is it a sword? Was it a key?
I don't remember.
I can't remember. We're sorry. We promise we read this book.
There are a lot of details. If you've read it, you know you're with us. And different details are going to stick with you more than others. Yeah. So
kudos
if
to
you
Erin
can remember, or if
you've
got a good interpretation of those, let us know in the comments.
It would be appreciated because I would actually kind of want to know.
Yeah.
Quote, Zachary takes the folded paper star from his pocket. He turns it over in his hand, letting it dance over his fingers. He hasn't read it. Not yet. The owl hoots at him. The son of the fortune teller tosses the paper star with his future inscribed upon it into the campfire. The flames consume it, charring and curling the paper until it is no longer a star. The words it once contained lost and gone forever, end quote. So obviously Zach finally receives the page that he was kind of curious about that tells the rest of his story. And when push comes to shove, he decides, I'm going to burn it. So the question is, why did Zach burn the paper? Did he burn it because he's not going to let fate dictate his life? Or did he burn it because he didn't want to know?
I think that's an excellent question.
What do you think?
It
could be something else too. Like he could have, I don't know, maybe it slipped.
No, I do think it was intentional.
Yeah, it was.
I think there's something to be said for wanting to, whether you believe in fate or not, wanting to feel like you have agency over your own life and your own decisions. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why. I think he felt like he didn't need to know. He didn't necessarily want to know.
Right.
And I think him knowing, he didn't necessarily want that to play a part in his decisions.
Which is fair, because I think many people, I forget the movie. It stars Morgan Freeman and Jack Nicholson. And they both are terminally ill. And they both play these old men. And I remember when Morgan Freeman's character finds out what he has and his timetable for what's remaining. I remember there's this line. I think he says something along the lines of, when I was younger, I thought knowing when you would die would be advantageous. And there's a long pause, and you see the face as he's receiving the information about how long he has. And he goes, turns out it's not. So maybe it's something like that. Maybe it's just best to not know. Like if predetermination is real, right? Fate is real.
Yeah.
Then maybe it doesn't. You can't do anything about it anyway at that point. So why even bother knowing?
Yeah.
Might as well keep it a surprise to you.
To know what good is knowing going to do for you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
quote, I remember the space more than the story that went with it, but I think the story part had to do with this hidden kingdom being a temporary space, end quote. Will you remember this story, or is it itself temporary?
I think I will remember this story because it was a rougher one for me. That's not to say it's phenomenally well written. I think it's a good book. I don't think I'm Erin Morgenstern's reader, and that's okay. Yeah, that's fine. There's stories for everybody. I think that's kind of one of the centerpieces of this book. But yeah, I don't think I'll remember it for lack of a better word, the difficulty of it. I read Act 1, no problem. It was a great setup. Yeah, and then I usually divide books into Act 1, Act 2, Part 1, Act 2, Part 2, and then Act 3. I think this has a phenomenal Act 1.
That's the filmmaker in him.
Sorry. Yeah.
No. It's fine. Like when you're a storyteller yourself.
Yeah. So I liked Act 1. I liked the setup. I liked everything about it. The harbor, the Starless Sea, Dorian and Zach, all that was cool. The intrigue, the mystery, the mystique. It was just cool. And then Act 2, I think you alluded to it at the beginning of our show, hun. It almost feels like it wanders, and there's not enough payoff to keep me engaged. So I kind of struggled to get through Act 2. Yeah. And then Act 3, it's good, but it's good because it finally wraps a few things up.
Yeah, you finally get some answers.
Yeah, but honestly, I feel like Act 2 this book could have been like 100 pages shorter. I think you really could have trimmed a lot. Yeah. But it's not my story. I mean,
there was one point where they went back into New York, and I was like, but we finally got to the Starless Sea, and I want to know more about that. Why are we going back to New York? I don't want to go back to New York.
Yeah. And then Allegra's
it's like, we just got here, and now you're sending us back to New York.
Yeah. And then Allegra's, she's framed up to be this big baddie, and then she's kind of not. It's kind of a disappointment. Yeah. You can probably tell by my tone that it's not going to be. It's
not your cup of tea.
Yeah, and it's not going
to be everyone's cup of tea.
Correct, and it's not going to be remembered by me for forever. Yeah, right? Like there'll be a point in time where I just kind of forget about it and be like, oh yeah, I read that, and then I won't be able to tell you much about it. I'll have to go back and watch this show. All right, so those are our discussion questions.
So who would you recommend this book to? I think if you liked Cloud Atlas.
Yeah, if you like Cloud Atlas, I would say if you are an avid fantasy reader, but you're a little worn out of the tropes, like the last 3 books you read, you were able to predict what happened, and you just want to try something different.
This is definitely different.
But you still want to stay within your preferred genre of fantasy. Yes. You could I think you should give this a shot. I think if you prefer your fantasy to be a little more tropey, you're not going to like this. And there's also no shame in just trying out this book. But but I think everyone will enjoy the first act, and I think a lot of people will struggle to get through the second act So I would recommend this book to a very particular person. I'd be hard to recommend this book. This isn't like a Project Hail Mary, or or like an easy to digest, YA Sanderson book, right? Where you can just kind of recommend it.
Yeah.
This is a book that's a very specific recommendation.
I think it would be a really good book for like a more advanced literature class. Like in school, right? Like because I remember in school doing a lot of like, let's interpret these passages. Let's find all these connections, yada, yada, yada. And I think it'd be really good for that because there's a lot that's open to interpretation. And I think it could lead to a lot of really interesting discussions.
So you'd almost recommend it for like
I would recommend it for like a school reading kind of thing. I think it'd be great for that.
Yeah, it is a good,
and it's more enjoyable than a lot that I had to read in high school.
Yeah.
Like there were some that I was just like, oh my gosh.
Oh dear.
This is well written, but the story is just so unlikable. And I think this is much better than that. But I think there's so much. It's beautifully written. I think it's got a lot of elements that could help you to learn some of the things that we had to learn in school, but in a more enjoyable way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So those are our discussion questions. Any one of them, if you felt we had a stupid take, if you felt we had a good take, or if you just want to share your own take, which that's what we really want to hear, let us know down below.
Let us know your take.
Let us know the comments. We'll be down there. Happy to chat. So now we're going to go into our next segment called Author's Take.
Yeah.
So all these clips are of Erin Morgenstern. By the way, I hope I'm saying her last name correctly. I think I am. And we're going to be commenting on them. But all these are taken from an interview with her. And you can watch this interview in its entirety on the Amazon Books YouTube channel. We will put the link in the description. By the way, just a quick backtrack to the our kind of abridged plot development. It was hard to write that, so I did refer to another blog that kind of helped me reformat everything in terms of like the actual plot of this book, because again it is difficult to kind of follow. So I will also link to that blog down below if you'd like to just kind of read that. So Author's Take, Clip 1. This is about the pressure and challenges of not being a one-hit wonder. So Erin wrote The Night Circus, which I heard was a really big hit.
I've not read that one either.
I've not read it either. And then
would you guys recommend that one? Let us know.
Yeah, and then she followed up with The Starless Sea. So this is her kind of take on the pressures of not being a one-hit wonder.
As soon as The Night Circus is out, it's like, when's your next book coming out? It's like, this took me like 5 years to write. They're like, why isn't it out yet? Like 2 months after this one came out. So it was hard because no one was waiting for The Night Circus and people were waiting for this one.
Absolutely.
And I really wanted to get it right. And I wanted it to feel as special as The Night Circus did. I didn't want to just like write something as quickly as I could just to have another book out, even like despite the constant things on Twitter of like, when's your next book coming out? When's your next book coming out? That slowly morphed into, I think Erin Morgenstern might be a one-hit wonder. Like, it's like, I'm gonna turn off my internet right now.
I'm gonna turn off my internet. Sometimes you gotta do that.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think she was in a very unique position, right? Because she wrote The Night Circus. I assume it was one of her few, if not only, attempt at publishing to get a story that she wrote published, and she found success. And even then, even if it wasn't, the level of success that she found, I think, is irregular, right? Like everyone wanted to talk to her about it and all that, and then all of a sudden that pressure of having to write another book,
the next one,
where you know there's an expectation, maybe there's a financial contract involved where you have to produce something, right?
And it's different when you have like a timeline versus having almost that freedom of being unknown, and being able to take your time with it and make sure you like it and are happy with it. And
I see. I kitty cat. Yeah, he or not he. Sorry, I was looking at Lou. He's a dude. Erin, she actually says in that interview that she turned off her internet, and she did that literally. She literally kind of went away, and she didn't have a TV or internet connection for, I guess, like a year or 2 years.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So she just, and she kind of did it, from my understanding, intentionally, but like also not like, she didn't make it a priority. Mm-hmm. So when it was kind of working for her, because I guess she had a whole nother novel or like a whole other kind of manuscript that just wasn't like fitting together or coming together the way that she wanted.
Oh.
And so then she kind of retreated.
Yeah.
And that's where she wrote the Starless Sea.
I mean, sometimes you need to. There's, with social media and stuff, the way it's kind of taken over, it's hard to get away when you are having people like make all these comments about you. Like, I think that was probably a great decision on her part to kind of get a break from, writing from a place of anxiety and like pressure. And then, sometimes you just have to turn everything else off to give yourself space.
Yeah.
And like some breathing room.
Yeah. I mean, I create videos for businesses, right? And that's artistic to a certain degree. It's more like commercial artistic, but even I have to, whenever I'm working on an edit or I'm reviewing an edit or whatever, I often have to step away for a day or two and then come back to it. Otherwise, I'm going to get bogged down in the weeds and I'm not going to make any progress.
Yeah. And I can't imagine trying to do something like that while also having all this speculation going out about like,
right.
Is he doing it? Is he working on another one? Like,
right. So you want to move to the next one?
Sure.
So this is where her inspiration came from for this.
Nice.
I have spaces in my head that just appear there, and I'm not really sure what they're doing. Like all this imaginary architecture that's just in my head. And I've had this sort of underground library-esque space in my head for years and years. I think some of the oldest things in this book are probably like things I wrote maybe like 15 years ago.
Oh, really?
Like they're very, very old pieces, like little tiny fragments of things. I had a notebook that just said, "There's a pirate in the basement," and I didn't know what he was doing in the basement. I didn't know where this basement was. I didn't know what I was going to use that for. I just had it in a notebook. I keep files of like pieces without places.
I don't know.
And just kind of to keep ideas down, because I will forget. I will forget that there's a pirate in the basement if I don't write it down.
I'll forget there's a pirate in the basement.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think her inspiration, or at least the logging of her inspiration, I'd say that's pretty par for the course for a lot of writers. They usually have a drawer or a folder somewhere where they're like, I don't know where this idea is ever going to live or if it ever will.
Yeah.
But I'm just going to put it here for now, and I'll refer to this pile of loose ideas when I need inspiration. So I guess
I've got collections of ideas for stories and stuff, and occasionally we'll have like just a scene, and I'll write out just a scene, and then I'm like, okay, well, there's that for now. Like,
yeah.
So, and I think it's nice because it also goes to show that like when you're pursuing something creative like writing a book, just how long it can take, and that's okay. Like, it's okay if it takes you a little longer, and it's okay if you get an idea and you don't do something with it right away. Like, it's okay. Like, you never know where it's going to come back around and fit. Like, I know I've seen or watched or heard an interview with Brandon Sanderson about how Mistborn was actually like a collection of several ideas, and the first iteration I think didn't have Vin, and then he had the idea. I wish I could remember exactly what it was, but there were, that one in particular was a combination of three different ideas of books that he had that at some point finally like kind of came together for him, and he was able to piece them together and create Mistborn.
Right.
So I think it's a very common thing for authors to just like have ideas. And so like if you are an aspiring writer, like, you know, maybe get a special notebook where you, or some sort of system, maybe index cards in a little box where you can write down your ideas and just kind of collect them and store them. And then don't be afraid to like play with them and see what kind of pieces together. And, you know, because it could create something more than you expected that might work better than what you had initially thought.
Right. That's well said. Let's see here. You want to queue up this next one?
That's this one?
Yeah, that's this
Okay, so for this one, she's answering what makes a story a fairy tale, and isn't all fiction just a fairy tale?
At one point, I was sending messy drafts to my editor, and at one point she said to maybe tone down the fairy tale, and I said, no. So I wrote actual fairy tales that are now in the book as their own isolated things. As another, there's several different books within the book, but one of them is a book of fairy tales.
I said no.
I love that. I love that. That's
and
fantastic. I hadn't heard this until like after reading the book.
Yeah.
But I love that she was just like, no, actually, I'm going to amp it up.
Basically, yeah. No.
And that ended up getting included and made for a really interesting story structure, I thought. So. Yeah.
So the question is, what makes a story a fairy tale? This is a much broader question outside the Starless Sea. What does make a story a fairy tale, right? Because we have, like, isn't all fiction fairy tale? Like, there's biographies; those aren't fairy tales.
No.
But is say lessons in chemistry, is that a fairy tale?
I mean,
right? Like,
yeah, my interpretation of fairy tales,
like, is there a certain criteria?
They have a magical element.
Okay.
And they're not long. They're more short stories. Okay. Magical short stories.
I think a fairy tale is I think
got some whimsy to them.
It's got some whimsy, and I think a good litmus test is, can you tell it to a child? Mm-hmm. And it's fantastical, of course, and that's what keeps the child engaged.
Right.
But there's usually a lesson.
There is usually a lesson.
There's a lesson within it. So
yeah.
And some fiction doesn't have a lesson. It's just entertainment. Mm-hmm. So I think not all fiction is a fairy tale.
I would agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where do you come down on this very important issue? Let us know in the comments below. Okay. The next one. So this right here, I personally found, so at the end, there's like diary entries. Erin wrote, she has different styles of writing throughout this whole book. And one of them is like a diary first person kind of entry.
So each, like we've already kind of discussed, right? Like Zach's story is the main plot line through the entire thing. And then each book, right? Because there are, 6 books?
6 books, yeah.
6 books. And each one of those is intermittent with a different book, right? So the first one is the Sweet Sorrows. The second one is the Ballad of Simon and Eleanor. That's interwoven with Zach's story. And in the book 6, the final part, it's interwoven with Kat's diary.
Yeah. So Erin even says that she found it easier to write Kat's diary. And I think it's because she had the story fleshed out and she was effectively kind of summarizing just from a different third-party perspective what was happening.
Yeah.
Or was it due to the style of writing that diaries usually have? Like I found it easier to read. I found it easier to follow. Is that just because it was more fleshed out, you think? Or was it because that's just kind of like the style of writings, and they're usually kind of straightforward? And we have a little clip here with some context from Erin, so let's play that.
I had that idea that I wanted multiple books within the book, and I wanted one to be a diary, but I didn't know whose. So that one of the books within the book is Kat's diary, and it's very different in style from a lot of the rest of the book. But I probably had some of the most fun writing those bits. They're some of my favorite parts of the book.
And I would agree. I would agree. I found them like Kat's diary actually helped summarized quite a bit of the book for me.
Oh,
so
for sure. Yeah. I think as a young woman, I think a lot of us do have journals and diaries that we write in to help kind of deal with things we're going through, teenage girl drama and such. And so I think it comes a little easier just because we end up getting more practice in it if you do keep a diary or a journal. And I think it is a little bit easier to write. So it depends on the writing style you prefer to write in. But I find first person is somewhat easy, right? Because you're saying, and you kind of put yourself in that person, that character's head, and just kind of write as them. So I find that a little easier than writing from third person.
Right, because you're doing the environment and the character, and you have to, the characters, you can directly communicate their emotion and what they're feeling, but it's more powerful in third person if it's shown what they're feeling, like through an action or through some decision that they've made or something of that nature, right?
And you can it's great because you can explore multiple characters, like what's going on in their heads, but from like that first person, you're like, and I think Kat was kind of a fun character too, because she's just like, I gotta figure out what's going on with Zachary. No one cares. His mom's not worried. I went and visited her. She's just like, I don't know, but I'm a fortune teller and he's not dead. And I don't understand. Like, he just up and disappeared. And
Kat said, no.
Yeah. And Kat's like, I've got to figure out what's happening. What went on with him? He had that book, and then there was like that thing, he came to the thing, and she's like taking it on herself that she's like, because I think she knows he was more introverted and didn't have a ton of friends either.
Right.
And so she kind of like had taken him under her wing, and I think she felt a bit of responsibility for him.
As friends
and
do
she's
for
like,
one another. Yeah.
the cops aren't doing anything. And so she was just like, at the end, the real MVP, like, I've got to figure this out.
Right.
Something's going down at this location. I'm going to get my little, I'm writing in my journal. I'm going to, here's where I'm at. Here's what I figured out. And then like, yeah, she was interesting because she was like on the outside trying to figure out what was going on and trying to solve the mystery, which is kind of where we had already been. And so it was kind of like, thank you, Kat. Thank you for like helping us out with this. Now we're not alone trying to figure out what's going on.
Right.
So.
That was great.
Oh.
Okay, so last author's take. Erin is not categorized as YA. This book is not categorized as YA, young adult. So some of the questions that we have here is age categorization of storytelling for the better, right? Does it make a difference for a book to be adult versus YA? Obviously, there's the whole, I don't want my kid reading that or this or that. I get all that. But in general, is it for the better for like stories being told? And is that the same? Is it better for the readers, writers, and the overall development of literature? And here is a take that kind of prompted those questions from Erin.
I'm not wild about age categorization for storytelling, especially the sort of stories that I tell. My books can certainly be read by teenagers. People sometimes get like upset when I say they're not YA, thinking that it means like teenagers shouldn't read them. That's not what I mean. Oh. Like, I mean, they're not categorized by publishing as being written for a teen audience. And I think I like that general audiences sort of thing where it can be a book for a wider age range.
I think it limits what you would potentially read otherwise. Right. So if you like, by the way, if you only read YA, that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you see the fact that it says that it's not in like the YA section, and you see it in more of like a more like adult section, like say it's not 6th grade level, it's now like, like high school level or something to like read it, and it takes a little bit more mental effort. I think you might miss out on quite a bit as a reader and kind of developing.
Yeah.
But that's just one angle of it too.
I think age categorization makes sense for early readers.
Okay.
Right, where you're like, this is going to have vocabulary appropriate for 1st graders versus 5th graders. As a reader, I have never put a lot of stock into age categorization.
Okay.
Just because I don't care. And I think there are some issues with it because like I've read Sarah Mass's books. Like Throne of Glass is in the YA section of the library.
Right.
And there are some things it's over there. The first book, not the whole series. I got a lot of the books though from the library, and there are some of the storylines that I would say like a 5th grader should not be reading. I think they're appropriate for high school and older, right? But I think once you get to like that level, I think YA can be deceptive because there are some stories where they're like romanticities, and if you read romanticy type books, you know about this already probably, but there are some of them where they are, because it's romanticy, they're categorized as YA, but there are some sizzling scenes, some very risque scenes that probably should not be in the YA section. Now, our library, the YA section is like several bookcases within the children's section.
Yeah.
And you don't want a child who's maybe like a 5th, 6th grader, right? Seeing a cover and being like, oh, this looks fun. I want to read this. And you think it's, as a parent, you think it's okay. And you don't know that there's some really intense, intimate scenes that maybe your child should not be reading at this time.
Right.
Or maybe just some like heavier, like the characters have been through some traumas that provides a little bit heavier content that you maybe they don't need to be reading right now. And then also like I think the problem with them being categorized that way too is then like you've got readers who might want to read those books and they don't know where to find them in the library, right? Because they're clumped in with the children's section and they maybe shouldn't be. So I think you get to this area of ambiguity where it's not necessary and doesn't necessarily help. I think as a writer, I don't think you should restrict yourself to like, oh, like unless you want to, that's your jam. But I don't think you should make that a restriction. I don't think you should hold back for like a specific category unless that's your goal. But otherwise, I think write what you want to write and then let the publishers figure out the categories. Or, you know, if you're independent publishing, then you're going to have to figure out your categories and then just pick the best fit. But I think there's a lot of stories that don't necessarily have one appropriate category. And I think once you get to a certain point, I feel like YA and above, like if I'm going to interpret something as YA, it's going to be more of like a 6th grade level where it's kind of like that's just my interpretation. I know that's not publishing's interpretation, but yeah. I think there are some things that are, in my opinion, incorrectly labeled as YA that should just be like adult or general. And I think if you're in high school and you want to read adult general books, you know, then you can. Like there's no rule. I've always read whatever I wanted, regardless of
and age, I think that's important.
Age grouping. But then, you know, like, I think it's more of a thing like for parents, right? Like, yeah, if you're grabbing a book from a children's section, you're going to assume doesn't contain certain content versus if you're grabbing a book for them from an adult section or an at-large section. Right. Words. Then you're going to be like, oh, do I need to check this first before I let my child read it? Right. So.
Right. It's kind of like when Twilight came out and all the moms read it first.
Yeah.
Before, you know, especially in the later books, I guess, whenever they get, I've never read them, but right. Like apparently they get a little more risque or a little, like there's some moments in it where I guess you'd be a little hesitant to let your 10-year-old daughter read it, so right? Like
I actually read the 4th one before my youngest sister because she was pretty young, and we knew that there was going to be like the baby birthed scene, right, like in Breaking Dawn, and so I was like, I just want to make sure it's not too much for her. And I can't remember how old she was at the time, but it was kind of like okay, let's just double check on this.
Right. Okay. Well, those were author takes. That's just the section where we kind of just go through and we listen to a few interviews of the author that we're reading, and we kind of just pull some more discussion questions.
Yeah, get a little more insight from the author themselves.
Yeah, so that full interview will be linked below again. Let us know if you liked that section or if you didn't. We'd be kind of curious. We kind of were just trying to think of a different kind of segment that we could do, and we thought that one might be fun. So yeah. This other segment is called Community Reviews. Ooh. So all these reviews are going to be linked below. These are just some highlights. So these are not our opinions. These are just some others. We might give some commentary about our thoughts, but these are other people's opinions. These are all from Goodreads, by the way. So this first review is from Lisa. She gave the book 2 out of 5 stars. Quote, "How are you feeling?" Zachary asks. "Like I am losing my mind, but in a slow, achingly beautiful sort of way." End quote. Lisa says, "Funny. I felt the exact same way while reading this book." She had a few points that she did get into specific. She did not mince words.
She gave reasoning.
Yeah, she gave reasoning here. And these are all just, again, kind of just summarized very quickly. All these reviews generally have a lot more detail that they put below, so I'm just giving you like the top line here. She said, "Number 1, I had no idea what was going on for the majority of this book. Number 2, there is no plot. Number 3, there was no antagonist or central conflict. Number 4, the main story is interrupted every other chapter, and it drove me crazy. Number 5, the characters are underdeveloped." But then some of her pros, she put the world in the Starless Sea is fascinating. And number 2, the writing is beautiful. So I think you guys have kind of gathered, if you were stuck with us this long, you kind of gathered where I sit on this book in general. I think Lisa is kind of in line with where I would be. A 2 out of 5 is a bit harsh because I think the writing is beautiful enough and at a level to where I think it is probably closer to like a 3.5. But the next community review, honey, you want to hit it?
Yeah, this one was by Katie. She gave it a 1 star and said, "I did not enjoy this at all. Pretentious, confusing, and jumping through time to make no sense whatsoever. I feel like I wasted a reading week. All my anticipated releases have been flops this year." Oh,
that's rough.
Yeah, she needs a good book.
She does.
Give Katie some recommendations of good books in the comments. She needs something good. Now, what is this book about? Honestly, your guess is as good as mine. There was a hint of some love stories, but they were so muddled into everything else that was pointless and made no sense, so who knows?
All right. So, and then obviously we're not all about the bad reviews here. There are way more positive reviews about this book than negative. We're just kind of giving you like 2 bad ones and 2 good ones. So here are the 2 good ones. From Charlotte, 4 out of 5 stars. Am I confused as heck? Yes. But was this book the most incredibly magical, moving, imaginative, and absolutely immersive gem I've read in a long time? Also, yes.
Nice.
All right. So high praise from Charlotte.
Yeah. And then from Emily, she said, "Reading an Erin Morgenstern book is like dreaming with your eyes open. There's something so profoundly beautiful about the Starless Sea that I don't quite know how to put into words." And then she has quoted, "Strange, isn't it, to love a book? When the words on the pages become so precious that they feel like part of your own history because they are." And I think that's kind of where you can see it definitely feels like a love story to stories in some ways.
Yeah. And I think that is an excellent point and quote to end this episode of Book Club Date on. I think sometimes there's a story for everyone. Mm-hmm. And this story may not be for you. It may be for you. But the only way you're going to know is if you give it a shot and read it.
Yeah.
So that does it for us. Find more of our content on YouTube. Subscribe to us at Book Club Date. You can follow us on any platform that we're at. I think we're on most podcast ones and everything, but we put a lot of content on YouTube other than just the show. So thank you so much. We'll see you next time. That's my wife, Katie.
And that's my husband, Josh.
Bye-bye.